Can war really be justified? That's the question we're asking this week. Now, many of us are familiar with the just war theory and the Catholic Church's teaching on war, but isn't the Christian message clearly a non-violent one? Well, that's what we're trying to sort out today. Our two guests, two career military people, Major Joseph Nonato and Major Jillian Federico. They will be with me shortly, but let's begin with a definition.
The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that the fifth commandment forbids the intentional destruction of human life. Because of the evils and injustices that accompany all war, the Church insistently urges everyone to prayer and to action, so that the divine goodness may free us from the ancient bondage of war. All citizens and all governments are obliged to work for the avoidance of war. However, as long as the danger of war persists and there is no international authority with the necessary competence and power, governments cannot be denied the right of lawful self-defense once all peace efforts have failed. According to the Catholic Church, defensive war is morally justifiable when it meets the following strict criteria. At one and the same time, the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. Furthermore, the Church and human reason assert the permanent validity of the moral law during armed conflicts. Practices deliberately contrary to the law of nations and to its universal principles are crimes.
Now, the Catechism of the Catholic Church also says that because of the evils and injustices that all war brings with it, we must do everything reasonably possible to avoid it. The Church prays, "From famine, pestilence, and war, O Lord, deliver us." Now, some people might think that this is a contradiction. Let's find out what our guests have to say. With us is Major Joseph Nonato. He is, I'm going to get this right, he's the officer commanding of Grenadier Company of the Royal Regiment of Canada.
That's correct.
Did I get it right? Okay. And with him is Major Jillian Federico. She is a chaplain with the Canadian Forces. You're both soldiers. You're both Catholic. You're here. Before we jump in to talk about a little bit about the Church's teaching, maybe if we can share with us a little bit about what your duties with the armed forces have been.
Well, myself as officer commanding Grenadier Company, well, I am a company commander of a reserve infantry company in Toronto, and what our job to do is to prepare our soldiers for operations domestic or overseas.
Okay. And you've been overseas? You've been deployed?
I have, yes.
To where?
To Afghanistan. I was serving there in Kandahar and Helmand provinces between June of 2008 to January 2009.
That's the only place that you've been deployed?
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And Jillian?
Well, I'm a chaplain, started out with a reserve unit and then was promoted to be a deputy brigade, or to be a brigade chaplain, and now I'm the deputy area chaplain for a Joint Task Force Central, Land Force Central area.
It's like all these. It sounds like code names or something. So as a chaplain, again, it might be, people might assume what that is, but what are your duties as chaplain?
Well, our primary responsibility is the pastoral care of the persons in a regiment or in a unit, and in my case, because I'm responsible for a group of chaplains for the larger area, and we're concerned with the welfare, particularly the spiritual welfare of people, and also responsible to advise commanders.
Okay. Now, you both have been with the armed forces for a long time. You're very familiar with the Church's teaching as well as with the just war theory.
Correct, yeah.
Is the just war theory realistic?
I think it is.
Yeah.
I really do.
How so?
Well, I mean, there is the right to defend yourself. There is the right to, out of charity even. Even the Church, if you take a look at the Catechism, one of the things that it does say is that somebody asks for help and you have the ability to provide it.
Yeah.
Part of charity is helping out.
Okay.
Right? So, and then when you take a look from that perspective, it kind of makes sense.
Okay. Would you agree?
And I would certainly agree that we have a responsibility to intercede on behalf of those who are weaker and who are being oppressed.
Does that apply to also to defend? You said defend ourselves. So this idea, like, what would you say to someone who says, "Well, Jesus preached, turn the other cheek"? How would you respond to that?
I think he did teach turn the other cheek, but there are also a good number of things that you can see in the gospel where he's also showing there is justice and there is a line that you can't cross.
Right. So you'd say that then the church's teaching is rooted in justice.
I would say, yeah. At least the very basic of justice and charity, right? The virtues of justice and charity.
Have either of you ever had any moral dilemmas? I mean, you've been to Afghanistan. I'm not sure what your duties while you were there were, in terms of, or what experience you had in terms of engaging the enemy. Is that, what do we call them? I don't know.
Oh, the insurgents?
Yes.
Yes.
So have you ever been in a situation where you've had a moral dilemma?
No, I don't think I was.
No? Have you ever had, Jillian?
No.
But in terms of counseling soldiers that
I've had to work with soldiers who have had struggles
Yeah.
with the role that they were playing, yes.
And what do you tell them? How do you go about that?
Well,
Easy
sometimes
question,
what you're dealing with is people who are struggling with their faith also. And so to try and help them to find answers within their faith.
Now, you told me earlier that you find that it is your Christian duty to be a soldier. That's how you serve God. Can you explain that?
Well, I think I started thinking about it when I was a child, when I was a Girl Guide of all things, when I promised duty
You just
to...
like uniforms.
You know, sure I do. Promised duty to God and the Queen. And so therefore, as I serve as a chaplain in the Canadian Forces, I think I'm just perpetuating that set of values that I started out with very young.
Yeah. Do you feel the same way?
I think so. Archbishop Fulton Sheen said in his little book there, The Soldier's Prayer Manual, or Wartime Prayer Book, he has one there, a little quote there, that one of the greatest vocations, just underneath the priest, is one of a soldier. And that because of the whole idea of sacrifice. The life of a soldier really entails quite a bit. I mean, you take a look at our reserves, even here in Toronto, they have to give up quite a bit in their daily lives, because they don't only have their daytime job, they also have the duties to Queen and Country, as you say.
Yeah.
Right. And then as a priest will lay his life on the line. As a priest will give up himself for others, so will a soldier.
Yeah, and that's obviously very apparent when you're defending someone else. And I guess we can get into that. I want to read to you a comment that came in. The question, can war really be just? We posted on Facebook. And Monica Chagoya, not sure where she is, in cyberspace somewhere, writes, do you mean just or justified? The problem with the human genius is that it can justify anything by calling it just. I believe that in this day and age, we can certainly find more peaceful ways of being just. How can there be justice when people are imposing by force ideological, political, or any other agendas? Knowing full well the impact and consequences of war does not justify it. War and justice is an oxymoron, but in a fallen world, perhaps a necessary evil. War does not prove who is right, only who is left. I just want to pick up on, because we talked about how it's a matter of justice. So how do we reconcile those two seemingly opposites?
I think Monica had a good line there. Could you please read the second to the last line of Monica's?
War and justice is an oxymoron.
Yeah,
but in a fallen world, perhaps a necessary evil.
I think that's what she's hit on, something right on the head there. In the ideal world, of course we'd like to be getting rid of war, but the fact is we are in a fallen world. There is the original sin, as we understand. And so there is that temptation of certain people to do things to others, right? We don't want to have crime in the streets, but it happens. We don't.
So do you see yourself as a defender of the weak, of the poor?
I think any good Catholic soldier would see themselves as that. Yeah, it is a vocation. I mean, not everybody gets called to the priesthood, but then again, not everybody gets called to become a soldier either.
No, absolutely not.
So, and so there is. Sometimes we look at ourselves. I'm sure that Jillian does that when we're going to duties. We at the end of an exercise weekend, we look at each other and go, "That's it. That's the final thing. I'm never going to do this again." But then as we're packing up, we're going, "Well, I'll see you Thursday. Yeah, I'll see you Thursday."
So why would you say that? So what is it? Because it's strenuous, because of the sacrifice, or because there's a line that you will not cross as a Christian?
Well, I think it's for all of those things.
Well, it's very physically demanding for one thing, and you know, as a grandmother, I sometimes found myself out in the tent in the middle of the night when I'm freezing cold, thinking I'd much rather be home cuddling one of my grandchildren, but here I am. And yet, ultimately, I really don't have any question about doing this. I know this is where I'm meant to be.
So let me just quickly, how do you live your faith on the ground? I mean, when you're in the middle of the exercise, or when you're, I mean, in a way, because you're chaplain, I'm not going to say that it's easier, but I think I can see how it can be easier. But when you're on the ground in Afghanistan, how do you live your faith when you're out there?
It's kind of hard, but I suppose it's just any Catholic living their life as a son or daughter of God. You live your life as a son or daughter of God. If you pray here in the morning and pray in the evening, and you read your Gospels once a day, and you pray your rosary and try to make it to Mass every single day while you're here, it shouldn't change while you're over there. There's no wartime Catholic and peacetime
you don't
Catholic.
put it on. Anyway, we're going to take a little break, but don't go anywhere, because we're going to be right back. This discussion continues, and in particular, we're going to find out what people on the street have to say about war.
Let us know your perspective. Email us at perspectives@saltandlighttv.org or reach us by mail, Perspectives at Salt and Light Television, 114 Richmond Street East, Toronto, Ontario, M5C1P1, or call us toll-free at 1-888-302-7181. Let your perspective be heard.
Where would we be now if we hadn't gone to war in World War II and World War I?
Yes, no, yes, if it's for freedom, but no, if it's for dictatorship.
It will never be necessary. War is not a good thing for nobody at all.
I think it's easier to say war is not good, but when it is the moment, it's difficult to stop the war and say no, stop.
Not desirable, but sometimes absolutely necessary. There's no question about that in my mind.
No, I don't think so.
I believe peacefully you can work things out.
Sounds like a contradiction to me.
I think it has to be when a sector of society is being oppressed, especially in a violent way. It's a necessary evil, but you have to be very careful on how you enter it.
Now, clearly there are a lot of people who are non-violent, or who are against war. You don't have to be a Christian to be against war, but does being non-violent or standing for non-violence means that you can't be a soldier?
No, I don't think so at all. I think that when a lot of people will go back to the fifth commandment and say, thou shalt not kill, right? But I think that what we really have to talk about is that thou shalt not kill, meaning thou shalt not murder. I mean, you can see here where being a soldier is not something contrary to being a Catholic. St. John the Baptist was baptizing. People were coming up to him and saying, what should I do? What should I do? Soldiers came up and said, what should I do? And if God really wanted, no war, this was God's prime opportunity to say, stop being a soldier. But he said, no, you should not tax people more than you don't do violence thing about, right? Yeah. So that's one prime example right there.
Yeah. But, okay, well, let me ask you right out, have you ever killed anyone?
No, thank God I haven't.
But and you probably have spoken to people who have, who are Christian or Catholics, because they come to you and they're struggling with that. So how do again, I feel like I'm asking the same question, but how do those two sort of come together? If you're, is that a line for a Catholic that'll say, well, maybe I can't be a soldier if I have to shoot someone?
I have worked with some very devout Catholic soldiers who have struggled with that, and generally will eventually come to the decision that what they did was necessary to achieve the end that they wanted, which is the help of the people who need defending. And I've worked with a lot of families of fallen soldiers too, and they will always respond, or nearly always respond, that person was there doing what they wanted to do because they believed in it, because they believed that they were helping somebody to a better life.
That's the message that we get clearly in the news every time the news comes from Afghanistan. Now, but how do you then develop, I guess, a personal spirituality to help you in those moments?
I think just having the same spirituality you have here, a good relationship with God. It sounds funny, but really, if you're close to God here and you understand that, okay, God gave you the vocation to do exactly this, and to be a defender rather than to be an aggressor, and then trusting our country and our government to send us to the right places and to send us where we're needed, then hopefully you have that comfort there.
So you have to be able to trust your commanders and your government. What if you don't agree with? I mean, I think with Afghanistan, at least I'm convinced that it's safe to say that it's a just. We're helping rebuild the country, we're defending, protecting, rebuilding. But that's not always the case with all armed conflict. But as a soldier, you have to obey your superiors. So where does the line, what happens when you don't agree with what you're being asked to do?
Well, do you want to take that one?
Well, we do certainly give our soldiers the right of conscience.
You do?
And we, all of our soldiers are educated to some degree in ethics.
Really?
And Canadian Forces chaplains are moral advisors to the commanders they're working with, so that certainly the questions of ethics do come into their choices.
Now, earlier you said that most of the soldiers that you've counseled come to realize that whatever they did was for a greater good. Have you ever worked with anyone who honestly regrets what they did and who doesn't think that it was for a greater good?
I personally haven't, no.
But that could happen? Do you know anyone?
Yeah, speaking to some soldiers that have come back, I don't think that there would be any kind of a human being, there's a strict human being, who would be able to take another human being's life and not feel anything from that. I think at the end of the day, there's that saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. Well, there are believers. When you're talking about one human life being taken away, and you're the person that's responsible for that, having spoken to people that have actually done that, you can see that they're troubled, right? They want to know, especially from the faith, and as Jillian was talking about, she's saying that he's speaking to a lot of people, and typically in the armed forces, when you get into discussions, it's because they are looking for their faith, they're looking for direction, and it just manifests itself in a war zone, because all of a sudden life and death is at the doorstep, right? And you're dealing with this every day, so questions come up. Am I on the right side? Is this something that's justified? So going back to the original question, really, then it becomes, is what we're doing over there something that God would ask you to do? And I don't know, the question that you asked us was that, can you reconcile that? And I think you can.
Yeah, you're making me think that it's not different than being a police officer who's on the street.
As a matter of fact,
their life might be in danger.
No,
because some people might think that soldiers are being, sent to Iraq to go and kill the enemy, and that's certainly not what the Canadian Armed Forces are doing.
No,
and certainly not in Afghanistan.
No.
I
think that a lot of police officers and and even soldiers take a lot of comfort in Romans chapter 13 verse 4, right, where you're talking there, and I don't know if you want me to pull it out there so you can have
what is it? Yeah.
Okay, let me just see if I can actually grab that here.
Yeah.
It was for the beginning of chapter 13. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of him who is in authority?"
Yeah.
All right. So when you're actually talking about this, and especially verse 4, where this is a kicker, "Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. If you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is a servant of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer."
Yeah.
And so really when you talk about a police officer and a soldier being sent out to do violence, right, to do a controlled violence, it is in the name of, it's kind of odd, but it's in the name of justice, charity, and peace.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In that particular regard.
Yeah. Let me read you another comment. This one came from Harrison Ayer. He's in British Columbia, actually. And so the question, can war really be just? He says, yes. If the conditions of war are justified for the sake of the defense of a people, then a war is just. Cardinal Ratzinger, in the late 90s, I believe, also mentioned that in light of the fact that we live in an age when weapons can be so destructive, we must evaluate under the concept of just defense whether a preemptive attack can be justified. If a nation is going to be using nuclear weapons against another nation, and those who have the power to make the prudential judgment have a reasonable certainty that this nuclear attack is going to happen, then it is being proposed that for the sake of the common good, a preemptive attack can be a legitimate defense. There were a lot of comments that came in, like this one. A lot of people familiar with the just war theory, and I don't know if, in light of the reality, have the rules of engagement changed because there are weapons of mass destruction, and how does that change, or does it, our approach to just war?
I think, Jillian, you may see this at the area sort of level, at the higher headquarters. But when you go to war, like you said, the Canadian soldier is very well educated and is a breed that has a lot of ethics training and whatnot. And our rules of engagement are very specific. And because we, as a Canadian society, know we have this capability of various weapons, that you can only escalate from one step to the other, with the whole idea of you cannot overstep your bounds. Right? You have a certain set of
For
arcs.
sure, and you're always going to start at the lowest level.
Right.
That is possible to achieve the end that you're aiming for.
Do you ever get, as a commanding officer, I mean, does this come up with the younger soldiers that you're in your regiment?
Coming up, like in terms of the moral
of their
question?
struggles or the moral questions. I'm impressed. Maybe I'm sad to say a little surprised that you're saying that Canadian soldiers are well educated in ethics. I'm baffled, but I guess glad. It makes perfect sense, but it's not something people think about.
Well, in the same way that I think most people are quite surprised to find the roles that chaplains have in regiments, in units, where they're very involved with the soldiers, spend a lot of time with them, and very much in their midst. And we're seen as being almost a bit of an oasis of peace in what can be a very chaotic time. And that even for those soldiers who are not Catholic, they will seek out the chaplain to try and find some peace in the middle of that.
Meaning because of
for sure.
Of it. That's all the time we have. We're completely out of time. I know this always happens. The discussion has to end here, but it will continue on Facebook. Facebook.saltandlighttv.org. It's time for our last words. We always leave the last word. Okay. I'm glad you brought it. It's a scripture passage already. But we leave the last words to the one who is the Word. So this is 2 verses from the Gospel from this coming Sunday, from Luke chapter 20, verse 37 and 38. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all of them are alive. So that's again from Luke chapter 20, verses 37 and 38. Joe.
Well, I think that this whole passage quite nicely ties into what we're talking about today, because it's talking about the dignity of the human person. It's talking about the dignity of the body. And with this, I think we have to recognize that right from the moment of conception to natural death or whatever, we have to respect that. And so as commanders on the ground have to make sure that when they make the decisions, not only can take into consideration the lives of their own soldiers, but that of the mission that they're being sent to, and even the lives of those who are opposing.
Right.
So.
And what jumps out at me in this is that our God is a God of the living, and that even for those soldiers who have died, that their memory and what they have fought for and what that meant to them and to those who love them lives on.
It's a nice message to conclude as we approach Remembrance Day, November 11th. So thank you so much for this discussion. Again, I wish we had more time, but now it's time to hear from you, our viewers. Visit our website, saltandlighttv.org/perspectives. Write in your comments. Our 2 guests have been Major Joseph Nonato and Major Jillian Federico, both soldiers, both Catholics, here with the Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you so much for being with us. That's all for tonight. We'll see you next week. May God bless you and your home.